I'm Amanda Harrison, 34, and until last month, I thought I knew my husband Jacob. When my grandmother left me her Vermont property and $2 million, I never imagined it would reveal who he truly was. The family meeting he arranged seemed innocent enough, until I walked in and saw 3 lawyers with documents ready for my signature. My heart dropped as Jacob smiled coldly and said, "Just sign here, honey." But they had no idea what was coming next. If you're watching this from somewhere cozy, drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button. Trust me, you'll want to see how I turned the tables when they tried to steal everything my grandmother worked for. My grandmother Evelyn was the strongest woman I've ever known. She wasn't just my grandmother, she was my role model, my confidant, and ultimately, my protector even after she passed. Growing up in a small Massachusetts town, I spent every summer at her sprawling Victorian home in Vermont. The house itself was a character in our story, 4,000 square feet of history with wraparound porches and gardens that bloomed spectacularly every spring. My parents were always working, so Grandma Evelyn became my second mother in many ways. What made Grandma Evelyn exceptional wasn't just her warmth, it was her business acumen. In the 1970s, when women were still fighting for basic workplace respect, she built a successful chain of specialty bakeries across New England. She started with one small storefront using recipes passed down through generations and expanded to 12 locations by the time she retired. "Never depend on anyone else for your financial security, Amanda," she'd tell me while teaching me to bake her famous apple pie. "A woman with her own money has options a woman without it can only dream about." Those summers shaped me. While other kids played video games, I learned about profit margins and business loans while picking blueberries from her garden. Grandma Evelyn never talked down to me, even when I was young. She'd explain compound interest over breakfast or discuss property values during our evening walks. My parents thought it was odd, but I absorbed everything. When I turned 18, she paid for my graphic design degree, insisting only that I maintain a perfect GPA and take additional business courses. "Your creativity is your gift," she said, "but understanding money will be your power." I graduated with honors and launched my freelance career with her guidance, building a solid client base that provided me a comfortable living. The last 2 years of her life were difficult. Cancer took her slowly, giving us time for goodbye but also forcing me to watch her once vibrant spirit dim day by day. I moved temporarily to Vermont to care for her, setting up a home office in the sunroom where she could watch me work. Even in her weakened state, she'd critique my designs and offer business advice between doses of pain medication. The day before she passed, she held my hand and said, "I've lived my life exactly as I wanted, Amanda. Promise me you'll do the same." I promised through tears, not knowing how soon that promise would be tested. The reading of her will 3 months later stunned everyone. While my parents and other relatives received modest bequests, I inherited the Vermont property, valued at $3.5 million, plus $2 million in diverse investments. Her attorney, Richard Bennett, explained that Grandma had structured everything specifically to remain solely in my name, protected from any future claims. At the time, I thought this was just Grandma's old-fashioned financial prudence. I didn't realize it was her final act of protection. Jacob and I had been married for 5 years when Grandma passed. We met at a charity event where I was designing promotional materials. He was charming, ambitious, and full of dreams about developing sustainable housing communities. His passion for creating homes that were both beautiful and environmentally responsible impressed me. He talked about architecture with the same fire my grandmother had when discussing business. Our courtship was a whirlwind of romantic gestures and deep conversations about changing the world through our respective talents. 6 months after we met, we married in a simple ceremony in my grandmother's garden. Grandma Evelyn took me aside afterward and said, "He seems good, but remember what I taught you." I assured her that Jacob and I had already agreed to keep our finances mostly separate, joint account for household expenses, separate accounts for our individual earnings and savings. She nodded approvingly. The first few years of marriage were good. Jacob's development company completed several successful small projects, and my design business was thriving. We were equal partners, or so I thought. Looking back, I can see the warning signs I missed, his dismissive comments when I spent holidays with my grandmother instead of his family, his subtle criticisms of Grandma Evelyn's obsession with money, the way he'd roll his eyes when she offered us financial advice. There were other red flags too. Jacob would sometimes make major purchases without discussing them with me first. When I'd raise concerns, he'd accuse me of being controlling or say, "Don't worry your pretty head about it." I'd feel a flare of indignation but push it down, telling myself all marriages require compromise. When Grandma became ill, Jacob was supportive at first, but as her condition worsened and I spent more time in Vermont, he became increasingly impatient. "Your business is suffering," he'd say, or "We barely see each other anymore." He visited rarely, always finding excuses to return to Boston early. In the year before I received my inheritance, Jacob's business hit trouble. A major development project went over budget and investors pulled out. He was stressed and distant, but insisted everything would turn around soon. I offered to help with my savings, but he refused, his pride apparently wounded by the suggestion. "I'll handle it," he'd snap whenever I asked about his company's finances. After the will reading, I returned home to find Jacob in an unusually ebullient mood. He'd prepared dinner, opened expensive champagne, and kept toasting to our future. When I mentioned preserving the Vermont property as Grandma had wanted, his smile faltered slightly before he quickly agreed, adding, "Of course, but think of all the other possibilities too." At that moment, I still believed we would use my unexpected windfall responsibly, perhaps pay off our mortgage, set aside college funds for the children we'd discussed having, and yes, possibly invest some in Jacob's business once it stabilized. I had no idea that night was the beginning of the end of everything I thought I knew about my marriage. The morning after learning about my inheritance, I woke to find Jacob already up, something unusual for him. He sat at our kitchen island, surrounded by papers, calculator in hand. His eyes had a gleam I hadn't seen in months. "Good morning, beautiful," he said, kissing my cheek. "I've been thinking about our future. With this inheritance, we can finally think big." I poured myself coffee, still groggy. "We should take some time to plan carefully. Grandma would want us to be thoughtful about this." Jacob barely seemed to hear me. "I've been working on numbers for the Riverside project. The one that stalled last year? With $2 million as capital, we could revive it and triple our investment within 18 months. The way he said our investment made me pause. "Jacob, I haven't decided what to do with the money yet. I'd like to honor Grandma's wishes for the Vermont property first." His smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course. The house is non-negotiable. But the cash, that's our game changer." He slid a document across to me. "I've drafted a business plan. This is our moment, Amanda." I skimmed the paper, noting how he'd already allocated the entire $2 million to his company. No discussion of our mortgage, no mention of savings or other investments, just a complete redirection into his struggling business. "This looks like you're planning to use all of the inheritance for your company," I said carefully. "Our company," he corrected. "You could join as creative director. Design all the interiors. It's perfect synergy." "I have my own business, Jacob. And I'm not sure I want to invest everything in one project." His face darkened. "After everything I've done for us? The stable home I've provided while you played with your little design projects." The contempt in his voice when describing my career, my successful career, felt like a slap. My business had actually been more stable than his for the past 2 years, something we both knew but never discussed. "My design work isn't a hobby, Jacob. And the inheritance is in my name. I want to be smart about this. In your name legally, but we're married. What's yours is mine and vice versa. That's how marriage works, Amanda." The conversation ended with Jacob storming out, claiming he was late for a meeting. That night, he returned home with an expensive bottle of wine and apologized for his enthusiasm. He said he just wanted us to capitalize on this opportunity. I accepted his apology, but something had shifted between us. Over the next week, Jacob's behavior grew increasingly concerning. At a dinner with friends, he announced, "We're finally joining the Millionaires Club," when someone asked about my grandmother's passing. I was mortified by both his insensitivity and his assumption. Later that night, I confronted him. Why did you tell everyone about the inheritance? And why do you keep saying we received it? Because we're married, he said, as if explaining something to a child. Don't be selfish, Amanda. Remember when my bonus paid for our kitchen renovation last year? Did I say that was only my money? That was $12,000 for our shared home, not millions for your business, I replied. His expression hardened. So you're keeping score now? Nice to know what kind of wife you really are. The pattern continued, Jacob alternating between love-bombing me with affection and gifts, then turning cold and manipulative when I wouldn't commit to funding his business. He began dropping comments about couples we knew who divorced over financial disagreements and telling stories about friends whose spouses supported their dreams. 3 weeks after the inheritance news, I scheduled a private meeting with Richard Bennett, my grandmother's attorney. His office in downtown Boston exuded old-world professionalism, all dark wood and leather-bound books. Richard himself, a distinguished man in his 60s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, had worked with my grandmother for decades. Amanda, your grandmother was very specific about her wishes, he explained. She structured your inheritance with several layers of protection to ensure it remained solely yours regardless of your marital status. Did she expect my marriage to fail? I asked, surprised. Richard chose his words carefully. Evelyn believed in preparing for all contingencies. She saw how your husband reacted when you spent time caring for her. She had concerns. I felt a chill. Had Grandma seen something in Jacob that I'd missed? What if I want to invest in my husband's business? You can certainly do that, but I'd advise creating proper legal documentation for any such arrangement. A business loan with terms, perhaps, rather than a direct investment or gift. When I returned home that evening, Jacob was waiting, his face thunderous. You want to see that old lawyer without telling me? I froze. How did you know that? Patricia saw you entering his building. Patricia, Jacob's mother. I hadn't noticed her. Were you getting advice on how to keep your precious money away from me? I was asking about Grandma's intentions, I said truthfully. Her intentions are irrelevant. She's dead and we have bills to pay. My business is underwater, Amanda. I've been trying to shield you from it, but we're in trouble. I need that capital. The conversation devolved into our worst argument ever. Jacob revealed he'd already been pitching new investors based on capital he didn't have, essentially promising my inheritance money without my knowledge or consent. He'd even shown potential partners architectural plans for projects that could only proceed with secured funding. You had no right, I said, my voice shaking. This is exactly why Grandma protected the inheritance. Jacob's face contorted with anger. So that's it? You don't trust me? After everything we've built. You've been hiding your financial problems while making plans for my inheritance. How is that building trust? He grabbed his keys. I need some air. When I get back, I hope you'll have remembered what marriage vows mean. Either you believe in us and invest in our future, or you clearly don't value this marriage. As the door slammed behind him, I sat in stunned silence, wondering how the man I married had transformed into this stranger who felt entitled to my inheritance. For the first time, I began to wonder if our marriage could survive this, or if it should. The morning after our explosive argument, I woke to an empty bed. Jacob had spent the night in our guest room, the first time in our marriage we'd slept apart due to conflict. At breakfast, he maintained a frosty silence, answering my attempts at conversation with one-word responses. Before leaving for work, he said only, I hope you come to your senses soon. This began what I now call the silent treatment phase, 10 days of minimal communication and maximum tension. Jacob would leave for work before I woke up and return after I'd gone to bed. On the rare occasions we were home together, he'd make sure I overheard phone conversations about his disappointing financial situation and how some people just don't understand partnership. The silence from Jacob was counterbalanced by a sudden flood of communication from his family. His mother Patricia called first, her voice sugary with fake concern. Amanda, darling, Jacob told us about your disagreement. I'm sure you don't mean to hurt him this way. Patricia, this is between Jacob and me, I replied, trying to remain polite. Family supports family, Amanda. When Robert lost his job years ago, I sold my mother's jewelry to keep us afloat. That's what love looks like. Similar calls came from Jacob's father Robert, his brother Michael, and even his Aunt Susan, all with the same message. I was being selfish, family money is shared money, and wasn't it suspicious that my grandmother had manipulated the inheritance to exclude Jacob? The most disturbing call came from Michael's wife Beth, who had always been friendly to me. Amanda, she whispered, sounding nervous, I'm not supposed to tell you this, but they've been having family meetings about how to handle you. Jacob says you're being stubborn, but will eventually give in. I thought you should know. She hung up before I could ask more questions. Meanwhile, Jacob's strategy shifted. One evening, he returned home early with takeout from my favorite restaurant and a bouquet of tulips, my preferred flower. I'm sorry, he said, looking appropriately contrite. I've been under so much stress with the business. I shouldn't take it out on you. Relief washed over me. I'm sorry too. We should be able to discuss this rationally. Jacob took my hand. You're right. Let's start fresh. Tell me what you're thinking about the inheritance. I explained my plans, preserving the Vermont property, setting aside funds for our future children's education, making some safe investments, and yes, potentially helping his business, but with proper legal structure. He nodded along, but when I mentioned Richard Bennett's suggestion of a formal business loan rather than direct investment, his jaw tightened momentarily before relaxing into a smile. Whatever makes you comfortable, honey. I just want us to be partners in this. The evening felt like a breakthrough, but the next morning while using Jacob's laptop to print a document, with his permission, I noticed his browser history included searches for marital property laws Massachusetts, wife's inheritance rights, and contesting unfair will provisions. Most disturbing was a search for divorce strategy when spouse has inheritance. I closed the laptop feeling sick. That evening, Jacob casually mentioned a college friend who was going through a divorce. Poor Gary, he said, shaking his head. His wife's getting half of everything, including the business he built before they married. Divorce courts don't care about fairness. The implication was clear. This was a threat. If I didn't cooperate, he'd pursue a divorce and try to claim half of my inheritance. What he didn't know was that my grandmother had anticipated this possibility. Richard had explained that the trust protections would make it extremely difficult for Jacob to touch the inheritance, even in a divorce. I called my best friend Samantha that night while Jacob was in the shower. Amanda, this isn't normal, she said after I explained the situation. He's manipulating you. The Jacob I know, or thought I knew, wouldn't behave this way. What should I do? I asked. Protect yourself. Document everything. And maybe consider if this marriage is worth saving. Her words hit hard because I'd been avoiding that very question. Did I want to save a relationship with someone who saw me as an ATM rather than a partner? For the next week, Jacob was uncharacteristically attentive and loving, bringing me coffee in bed, sending flowers to my office, suggesting weekend getaways. To anyone looking in from outside, we appeared to be a couple rekindling their romance. But I noticed how conversations always circled back to finances, the future, and our dreams, which inevitably centered around his business plans. Then came the dinner invitation. Jacob made reservations at Maison Laurent, the upscale French restaurant where he'd proposed 5 years earlier. He ordered champagne, reminisced about our early days, and held my hand across the table. I've been thinking about everything you said, he told me, his eyes earnest. You're right that we need to be strategic about the inheritance. Relief flooded through me. I'm so glad you understand. I do. And I think it's time we clear the air with my family too. They've been concerned. My guard went back up. What do you mean? My parents have invited us for dinner this Sunday. A family meeting to reset everything. Mom's making her famous pot roast. He squeezed my hand. It would mean so much to me if we could all move forward together. Something in his tone made me uneasy. Will Michael and Beth be there? No, just us and my parents. An intimate family dinner. He paused, then added, and I think it would be best if you came alone. I'll head over early to help Mom prepare. Warning bells rang in my mind. Why would I come separately? I need to talk to them first, smooth things over. You know how protective my parents are. He smiled reassuringly. It's nothing sinister, Amanda. I promise. I agreed, but my instincts were screaming. That night, I couldn't sleep, replaying Jacob's words and behavior. By morning, I'd made a decision. I called Richard Bennett's office and scheduled an urgent appointment. I need your advice, I told him, explaining Jacob's dinner invitation and my suspicions. Richard's expression grew grave. Amanda, this sounds potentially concerning. Your husband may be planning something. Like what? It could be an attempt to pressure you in a group setting. I've seen similar situations before. What should I do? Richard thought for a moment. Attend if you feel safe doing so, but be prepared. Would you like me to be available that evening? You would do that? Your grandmother was not just my client, but my friend for 30 years. I promised her I would look after you. He wrote his cell phone number on a card. Text me the address. I'll park nearby and be ready if you need support. If anything makes you uncomfortable, message me with the word documents, and I'll come in. As Sunday approached, Jacob's behavior grew increasingly suspicious. He was secretive about phone calls, disappearing into another room to speak in hushed tones. He asked seemingly casual questions about whether I'd spoken to Richard recently. And most tellingly, he reminded me 3 separate times not to bother dressing up for dinner at his parents' house, something he'd never cared about before. The morning of the dinner, I found Jacob reviewing papers in his office. He quickly shuffled them into a folder when I entered. Just some work stuff, he said, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. Jacob, I said carefully, is there something I should know about tonight? Just dinner with my parents. Why so suspicious? Because you've been acting strangely. He stood and kissed my forehead. You're imagining things. It's going to be a great evening. As he left to help his parents, I sat in our quiet house, contemplating what might await me. Whatever Jacob was planning, I wouldn't face it unprepared. I texted Richard the address of my in-laws' home with the message, dinner at 6 p.m. Thank you for being my backup. His response came quickly, I'll be parked down the street from 5:45. Trust your instincts, Amanda. With that reassurance, I prepared to face whatever ambush Jacob and his family had planned. The drive to my in-laws' suburban home normally took 20 minutes, but Sunday evening traffic stretched it to nearly 40. During the drive, I vacillated between thinking I was overreacting and feeling certain something was wrong. Jacob had called twice already, asking where I was in an unnaturally cheerful voice. We're all waiting for you, honey, he said the second time, a hint of tension beneath his words. As I turned onto the Oakline street where Robert and Patricia lived, I immediately noticed the unusual number of cars parked along the curb, at least 5 vehicles I didn't recognize. This wasn't going to be the intimate family dinner Jacob had described. I parked and texted Richard, multiple unknown cars present. Proceeding with caution. His reply came instantly, I'm in position. Signal if needed. The sprawling colonial house looked as immaculate as always, with Patricia's prize roses framing the entryway. I took a deep breath, straightened my blouse, and rang the doorbell. Patricia answered with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. Amanda, finally. Everyone's waiting. Her voice had the artificial brightness she reserved for people she disliked, but needed to impress. Everyone? I thought it was just family, I said, stepping into the marble-floored foyer. It is family business, she replied cryptically, leading me toward the formal living room rather than the dining room where family meals were typically served. Jacob met me at the living room entrance, kissing my cheek mechanically. Glad you made it, honey. The scene inside made my blood run cold. Seated on the antique furniture were Jacob's parents, his brother Michael, who Jacob had specifically said wouldn't be there, and 3 strangers in business attire, 2 men and a woman, all with leather portfolios on their laps. No food was visible anywhere, no place settings, no hint of the promised dinner. Amanda, Jacob gestured to the empty seat clearly left for me, an isolated armchair facing everyone else like a witness stand. These are some financial advisors and attorneys who are helping us sort everything out. The oldest of the 3 stood and extended his hand. Gerald Whitmore, Estate Planning. A pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Harrison. I shook his hand automatically, my mind racing. I wasn't aware we needed estate planning today. I thought we were having a family dinner. Patricia laughed, a brittle sound. We'll eat later, dear. First, we need to address the situation that's causing so much tension in your marriage. What situation is that exactly? I asked, remaining standing despite Jacob's attempts to guide me to the isolated chair. The female attorney opened her portfolio. Mrs. Harrison, we've prepared a comprehensive plan for family asset consolidation that would benefit everyone while protecting the legacy your grandmother left. Family asset consolidation? I repeated. Please sit, Jacob said, his voice hardening slightly. Let them explain. Reluctantly, I sat. For the next 20 minutes, I listened as the three professionals took turns explaining their solution to a problem I didn't know existed. They used phrases like equitable distribution, family trust restructuring, and unified management approach. The documents they occasionally referenced were never passed to me, but I could see enough to realize they involved transferring my inheritance into accounts that would give Jacob control. Gerald Whitmore spoke with practiced sincerity. Your grandmother's intentions were admirable, but perhaps short-sighted regarding your marriage. This approach honors her memory while acknowledging your husband's role in your shared future. And what exactly would this restructuring entail? I asked. The second male attorney, a younger man named Bradford something, finally handed me a thick document. This agreement would transfer the Vermont property and investment portfolio into a jointly managed trust with primary executive authority granted to Jacob as the more experienced financial manager in your partnership. I skimmed the first page, my hands growing cold as I realized the depth of the betrayal unfolding. This wasn't just about accessing my inheritance. This was about taking complete control of it. This would give Jacob unilateral authority over everything my grandmother left me, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. With your consultation, of course, Bradford added smoothly. It's a partnership. A partnership where one person has all the power? Jacob interjected, Amanda, be reasonable. My business experience makes me better qualified to manage these assets. It's the sensible approach. Robert, Jacob's father, spoke for the first time. Amanda, we've always considered you family. But family works together. Jacob has shared how difficult you've been about this windfall. Windfall? I repeated, anger rising. My grandmother built her business from nothing. She worked for 50 years to create this legacy. It's not a lottery ticket. Patricia dabbed at non-existent tears. While some of us struggle to make ends meet, you're sitting on millions. Do you know Robert's business nearly went bankrupt last year? We had to remortgage this house. Yet you won't help your own family. I looked around the immaculate living room with its designer furniture and original artwork. This doesn't look like struggling to me. Michael leaned forward. The point is, you're breaking my brother's heart with your selfishness. What kind of wife refuses to support her husband? A wife whose husband is trying to take control of her inheritance through manipulation and ambush, I replied. The room fell silent for a moment. Then Jacob recovered, his voice gentle as if speaking to a child. No one's ambushing you, Amanda. We're trying to help you make the right decision. These documents protect everyone's interests. Gerald Whitmore nodded. Mrs. Harrison, in my 30 years of practice, I've seen many families torn apart by inheritance disputes. This agreement provides a clean, reasonable solution. And if I don't sign? Jacob's expression hardened. Then you're choosing money over our marriage. I can't stay with someone who doesn't trust me or value our partnership. So it's ultimatum time? Sign or divorce? No one's saying divorce, Patricia interjected quickly. But you need to decide what's more important, your grandmother's money or your husband. Bradford slid a pen across the coffee table toward me. All the documents are properly prepared. Once signed and notarized, Melissa here is a notary. The transition of assets can begin immediately. I picked up the pen, turning it in my fingers as everyone watched expectantly. Jacob's smile returned, confident and self-satisfied. Patricia nodded encouragingly. Robert checked his watch impatiently. You know, I said quietly, my grandmother always told me to trust my instincts. And right now, they're screaming at me. Amanda, Jacob started, warning in his voice. I smiled and set the pen down. Funny, I brought someone too. I pulled out my phone and typed a single word, documents. Then I looked back at the confused and increasingly concerned faces surrounding me. What does that mean? Jacob demanded. It means, I said calmly, that I'm not as naive as you all seem to think. The doorbell rang, its chime cutting through the tense silence like a knife. Patricia's face tightened with annoyance. Who could that be? Robert, would you? I'll get it, I said, standing quickly. Since I'm expecting them. Jacob grabbed my arm. What have you done? I pulled free. Created my own backup plan. Just like you did. I walked to the front door, aware of footsteps behind me as Jacob and Gerald Whitmore followed. Opening the door, I felt a wave of relief seeing Richard Bennett standing there, leather briefcase in hand, his silver hair and impeccable suit giving him an air of unquestionable authority. Right on time, I said. Please come in. Richard stepped inside, surveying the scene with practiced calm. Good evening. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Jacob's face flushed with anger. Amanda, what is this? Jacob, I said, making introductions, this is Richard Bennett, my grandmother's attorney and now mine. Richard, this is my husband Jacob, and behind him is Gerald Whitmore, apparently an estate attorney. The two lawyers sized each other up like boxers before a match. Richard spoke first. Mr. Harrison, I understand you've organized quite a gathering to discuss my client's inheritance. Your client? Jacob sputtered. Amanda is my wife. Yes, and also my client, Richard replied smoothly. Shall we join the others? I'm quite interested in these documents I hear you've prepared. We returned to the living room, where Patricia was whisper-arguing with Robert and Michael, while the other attorneys shuffled papers nervously. Richard set his briefcase on the coffee table and addressed the room. Good evening. I'm Richard Bennett, representing Amanda Harrison in matters relating to the Evelyn Taylor estate. I understand you've prepared some documents for my client's signature. Bradford attempted to gather the papers. This is a private family matter, involving the legal disposition of assets for which I am the trustee, Richard countered. May I see what you've prepared? Reluctantly, Bradford handed over the document. Richard scanned it quickly, his expression remaining neutral except for a slight raising of his eyebrows. Interesting approach. Creative, even. Though I see several provisions that directly contradict the terms of Evelyn Taylor's will and the irrevocable trust she established. Trusts can be modified, Gerald argued. With proper consent from all parties. Indeed they can, under certain circumstances, Richard agreed. However, this particular trust includes specific language prohibiting exactly the type of modification you're proposing, especially regarding spousal control of assets. Jacob stepped forward. This is ridiculous. She's my wife. We share everything. Richard opened his briefcase and removed a folder. Mr. Harrison, are you aware that you contacted my office 3 times in the weeks before Mrs. Taylor's death, requesting information about her will and estate plan? The room fell silent. Jacob's face paled. That's not true, he stammered. I have phone records and notes from those conversations, Richard continued, removing a sheet of paper. In your 3rd call, you specifically asked about the possibility of contesting the will if you found its terms unsatisfactory. Patricia stood up, hands clenched. This is outrageous. You can't come into our home and make these accusations. I'm simply stating facts, Mrs. Harrison. Facts that became concerning enough that I began keeping detailed records of all interactions with your son. Richard turned to me. Amanda, did you know that Jacob visited my office the day after the will reading, demanding to see documentation of the trust arrangements? I shook my head stunned. No, he never mentioned that. Because it wasn't relevant, Jacob snapped. I was trying to understand our financial position. I repeated. You knew from the beginning it wasn't ours. Richard continued methodically. I also have here a copy of an email Jacob sent to Mr. Whitmore 2 weeks ago, outlining his plan to, and I quote, create a scenario where signing is the only reasonable option. The email specifically mentions staging a family intervention to pressure Amanda into transferring control of her inheritance. Jacob lunged toward Richard. Where did you get that? That's private communication. It was forwarded to me by someone concerned about your intentions. Someone in this room, actually. Richard glanced briefly toward Michael, whose eyes dropped to the floor. Jacob followed Richard's gaze. Michael? You betrayed me. Michael looked up, his expression conflicted. This went too far, Jake. Using family to manipulate Amanda? Creating fake financial emergencies? Beth and I didn't sign up for this. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Fake financial emergencies? Your business isn't in trouble. Jacob's face contorted with rage. Of course it's in trouble. But not for the reasons I told you. He stopped, realizing what he'd admitted. What reasons, Jacob? I pressed. The room fell silent as Jacob struggled to respond. Finally, Robert spoke up, his voice weary. Tell her the truth, son. This has gone far enough. Jacob sank onto the sofa, deflated. Fine. The business isn't failing because of the market or investors pulling out. It's because I made some bad bets. Personal ones. What kind of bets? I asked, already suspecting the answer. I have a gambling problem, he admitted quietly. It started small. Poker games with developers, sports betting. But it escalated. I took out loans to cover losses. Used business funds. The Riverside project didn't fail. I diverted the investment money to cover gambling debts. The admission hung in the air. Patricia covered her face with her hands. How much do you owe? I asked. About $800,000, he whispered. Richard intervened. Actually, according to the documents I've obtained, it's closer to $1.2 million. Mr. Harrison has taken out multiple high-interest loans using his company as collateral. I felt physically ill. And you wanted my inheritance to bail you out. I was going to pay it back, Jacob insisted. Once we got the business back on track. With what? I asked. More gambling. Gerald Whitmore cleared his throat. Perhaps we should adjourn this discussion and reconvene when emotions aren't running so high. Richard closed his briefcase with a definitive click. I believe that's wise. However, before we conclude, I should inform everyone present that attempting to coerce a signature on legal documents constitutes duress, which would invalidate any agreement even if signed. Additionally, the coordinated effort to manipulate my client into transferring assets could potentially be viewed as attempted fraud. Patricia gasped. Are you threatening legal action against us? Simply stating facts, Richard replied calmly. Amanda, are you ready to leave? I nodded, suddenly exhausted by the whole charade. As I stood, Jacob grabbed my hand. Amanda, please. I made mistakes, but I love you. We can work this out. I looked into the eyes of the man I'd married, searching for the person I thought I knew. The Jacob I loved wouldn't have done any of this. He wouldn't have lied, manipulated, or tried to steal what my grandmother worked her whole life to build. I'm still that person, he pleaded. This isn't me. It's the addiction talking. No, I said firmly, pulling my hand away. The addiction might explain the gambling, but it doesn't explain the lies, the manipulation, or how quickly you were willing to threaten our marriage to get what you wanted. That was all you, Jacob. I turned to his family. And all of you were willing to help him bully and manipulate me. Some family. Patricia started to respond, but Robert placed a restraining hand on her arm, shaking his head slightly. As Richard and I walked toward the door, Jacob called out desperately, "What about our marriage? 5 years just thrown away." I paused at the threshold. You threw it away the moment you decided my inheritance was more important than my trust. Goodbye, Jacob. Walking out that door was the hardest and most liberating moment of my life. As Richard and I reached our cars, I felt the first tears begin to fall, not for the money that had nearly been stolen from me, but for the marriage I now realized had always been built on a foundation of sand. I spent that night in a hotel, too emotionally drained to return to the home I shared with Jacob. Richard had offered to call Samantha for me, but I needed solitude to process the magnitude of what had happened. The room was anonymous and characterless, beige walls, generic artwork, stiff sheets, but it provided sanctuary while my world collapsed around me. Jacob called 17 times that night. I let each call go to voicemail, listening to his messages evolve from desperate pleas to angry accusations to tearful apologies. By morning, exhaustion had replaced shock, but with it came clarity. I needed to protect myself and my assets immediately. Richard met me for breakfast in the hotel restaurant, his calm presence grounding me as we developed a plan. First priority, securing my financial independence. I've already contacted the banks and investment firms, Richard explained. Your accounts are flagged for heightened security. No transfers or withdrawals can occur without multi-factor authentication. Thank you, I said, stirring my untouched coffee. What about the house? The Boston property is jointly owned, which complicates matters. For now, I recommend you retrieve your essential belongings and personal documents while Jacob is at work. With Richard's assistant Monica accompanying me as a witness, I returned to our brownstone that afternoon. Jacob was indeed absent, but evidence of his desperation was everywhere. Dozens of yellow legal pads filled with calculations of my inheritance, browser tabs open to articles about contesting wills, empty whiskey bottles on the kitchen counter. As I packed clothes and personal items, I discovered the first of many financial secrets Jacob had kept. Hidden in his desk drawer was a stack of credit card statements showing hundreds of thousands in gambling debts, cash advances, and luxury purchases I'd never seen: watches, designer clothes, weekend trips I knew nothing about. Some statements were addressed to our home, others to a P.O. box I didn't know existed. Monica, can you photograph these? I asked, hands shaking. She methodically documented everything while I continued searching. In our bedroom closet, behind Jacob's golf clubs, I found a safe I'd never seen before. It was unlocked. He must have accessed it recently and contained more damning evidence: multiple loan agreements with exorbitant interest rates, letters from creditors threatening legal action, and most disturbingly, documents showing he had taken out a second mortgage on our home without my knowledge, forging my signature on the paperwork. This is definitely fraud, Monica said quietly, photographing each document. You'll want to report this to the authorities. I nodded numbly, wondering how the man I married could have descended into such deception. By the time we finished, I'd filled 3 suitcases with clothes and personal items, plus a box of financial records that painted a picture of a double life I never suspected. As we were loading the car, Jacob's BMW screeched into the driveway. He jumped out, his face a mask of fury when he saw the suitcases. What do you think you're doing? He demanded, blocking our path. Getting my things, I replied calmly, though my heart raced. Please move, Jacob. So that's it? You're leaving me? After everything we've built. After everything you've destroyed, I corrected. I found the credit card statements, Jacob. And the second mortgage. With my forged signature. His face paled. I can explain that. To the police, perhaps. Now please move. Amanda, you can't do this to me. I'll lose everything. You did this to yourself. And to us. For a moment, I thought he might become violent, but Monica's presence and her obvious recording of the interaction on her phone seemed to give him pause. He stepped aside, his shoulders slumping in defeat. This isn't over, he said as we drove away, but it sounded more desperate than threatening. Over the next 2 weeks, I discovered the full extent of Jacob's deception. With Richard's guidance, I hired a forensic accountant who uncovered years of financial manipulation. Jacob had been siphoning money from our joint accounts into gambling and hidden personal expenses, while simultaneously building an image of himself as the primary breadwinner. In reality, my design business had been subsidizing our lifestyle for years while he lost money and lied about his company's performance. The revelations kept coming. Jacob alternated between tactics, sometimes sending flowers and heartfelt apologies, other times having his lawyer send threatening letters about his rights to my inheritance. When those approaches failed, he tried turning our friends against me, spinning a story about me abandoning him during a mental health crisis. Some friends believed him, which was painful but revealing. Others, like Samantha, stood firmly by my side. The Jacob we knew was a carefully constructed fiction, she said over wine in her apartment where I was temporarily staying. You're seeing the real him now. Perhaps the most surprising ally emerged in Beth, my brother-in-law's wife. She called me privately, offering to meet at a cafe far from family scrutiny. "I've wanted to warn you for years," she confessed, glancing nervously around the cafe. "Michael and I suspected Jacob had problems, but we had no idea how deep they went until recently." "Why didn't you say anything?" I asked. "Family loyalty," she said with a grimace. "But also, Jacob is incredibly convincing. He always had explanations that seemed plausible." It wasn't until he started planning this ambush that Michael finally saw the truth. Beth revealed that Jacob had a history of targeting financially successful women. "Before you, there was Natalie. She owned a successful bakery chain. Reminded me a bit of your grandmother, actually." Their relationship ended abruptly when she caught him trying to add his name to her business accounts. This information led me to contact Natalie Weber, now living in Chicago. Our phone conversation confirmed my worst fears. Jacob had followed an almost identical playbook with her, love bombing followed by financial manipulation, culminating in an attempt to seize control of her assets. "I never reported him," Natalie told me. "I was too embarrassed, and he hadn't actually succeeded in taking anything. But I should have. Maybe it would have saved you from this." "You couldn't have known," I assured her, though privately I wished she had raised the alarm. Filing for divorce was surprisingly easy compared to the emotional turmoil surrounding it. Richard connected me with Diana Marsh, a divorce attorney specializing in complex financial cases. She was confident the prenuptial agreement Jacob and I had signed would hold up, especially given the evidence of his fraud and manipulation. "The inheritance is completely protected," Diana explained. "The challenge will be the joint assets and addressing the fraudulent second mortgage." Jacob contested the divorce, of course, but his position weakened dramatically when his gambling creditors began legal proceedings against him and his company. Faced with potential criminal charges for the forged mortgage documents, he became more amenable to settlement discussions. Throughout this period, I stayed at Samantha's apartment, venturing out only for legal meetings and therapy sessions. Jacob's family launched what can only be described as a smear campaign, telling mutual friends I was mentally unstable, that I'd always resented his family, that I was abandoning him during a health crisis. Some people believed them, which hurt more than I expected. 6 weeks after the ambush dinner, I agreed to meet Jacob one final time to exchange some remaining personal items. We met at a neutral coffee shop, both accompanied by attorneys. He looked terrible, unshaven, clothes wrinkled, dark circles under his eyes. "You've ruined me," he said quietly as our lawyers discussed logistics nearby. "You ruined us," I corrected. "There's a difference. I made mistakes, but I loved you. You loved what I could provide you. That's not the same thing." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It wasn't all a lie, Amanda. We had good times. Real ones." Looking into his eyes, I searched for the man I thought I'd married. Maybe, but they were built on a foundation of lies. I'll never know what was real and what was manipulation. As I stood to leave, he grabbed my wrist. "I can change. I'm in Gamblers Anonymous now. Therapy twice a week. Give me another chance." For a brief moment, I felt the pull of our history, the weight of 5 years together. Then I remembered the documents, the forgery, the elaborate ambush with his family and lawyers. "Goodbye, Jacob," I said, gently removing his hand. "I hope you get the help you need. But not from me." Walking away from that coffee shop felt like emerging from a long, dark tunnel. The divorce proceedings would continue for months, but in that moment, I knew with certainty that I was reclaiming not just my inheritance, but myself. 1 year after the fateful family dinner that ended my marriage, I stood on the wraparound porch of my grandmother's Vermont house, now my house, watching the first spring flowers push through the soil in the garden. The property looked different now, renovated according to plans Grandma Evelyn had sketched but never implemented. The old carriage house converted into studio spaces, the sunroom expanded into a gallery. The grounds landscaped with native plants that would bloom in succession throughout the growing season. This transformation wasn't just physical. In the 12 months since discovering Jacob's betrayal, I'd undergone my own metamorphosis, from betrayed wife to independent woman building a life entirely on my own terms. The divorce had finalized 4 months earlier. Jacob, facing criminal charges for the forged mortgage documents, had eventually agreed to a settlement that required him to relinquish any claims to my inheritance or business. In exchange, I didn't press charges for the forgery, though I couldn't stop the bank from doing so. Last I heard, he'd made a plea deal involving restitution, probation, and mandatory treatment for his gambling addiction. His family had maintained their united front against me until the evidence of Jacob's deception became too overwhelming to deny. Robert and Patricia retreated into silence, while Michael and Beth cautiously reached out with an apology that seemed genuine, if uncomfortable. I accepted it graciously but maintained my distance. My graphic design business had flourished after I rebranded and expanded, taking on 3 junior designers and moving into brand development for sustainable businesses. Working primarily remotely allowed me to live in Vermont while maintaining my Boston clients and developing new ones across New England. But the most meaningful transformation was what I'd done with my grandmother's legacy. Using the main house as my residence and office, I'd converted the outbuildings into the Evelyn Taylor Artists Retreat, a space where female entrepreneurs and artists could come for residencies ranging from 2 weeks to 3 months. The program provided housing, studio space, business mentoring, and a small stipend to women developing creative businesses. "Your grandmother would be so proud," Richard said during his quarterly visit to review the trust finances. "This is exactly the kind of legacy she envisioned." I smiled, thinking of Grandma's words, "A woman with her own money has options." She'd been right in ways neither of us could have anticipated. The healing hadn't been easy or linear. In the months after the divorce filing, I'd experienced periods of crushing self-doubt. How had I missed the signs? Was I partially responsible for the marriage's failure? Had there been good in Jacob that I was now unable to see through the lens of betrayal? Therapy helped, as did the support of true friends who stood by me. Samantha visited monthly, while new friendships formed with local artists and business owners who knew nothing of my history and accepted me as I was now. Most healing was the weekly dinner I hosted for retreat residents, where conversations about creativity, business, and life's challenges reminded me that vulnerability could exist without exploitation. 8 months after the separation, a thick cream envelope arrived with no return address. Inside was a handwritten letter from Patricia, Jacob's mother. "Amanda," it began. "This letter is long overdue. I owe you an apology for my role in what happened. A mother always wants to believe the best of her child, but I allowed that natural instinct to blind me to Jacob's faults and to make you the villain in a story where you were actually the victim. Robert and I are ashamed of our actions and the pain we caused you." The letter continued, explaining that Jacob's gambling addiction had finally come to light in the family when he was arrested for the mortgage fraud. They'd discovered he'd borrowed substantial sums from family members under false pretenses as well. "None of this excuses our behavior toward you," she wrote. "We should have asked questions rather than making assumptions. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I recognize the harm we caused." I read the letter several times before filing it away. Forgiveness might come eventually, but distance was healthier for now. As spring progressed into summer, I found myself hosting gatherings for the first time since the divorce, small dinner parties for retreat residents and local friends, weekend workshops open to the community, even a midsummer gala that raised funds for a scholarship program. My grandmother's friends from her business days attended, sharing stories I'd never heard about her early struggles and triumphs. "Evelyn would have thrown you out if you'd wasted this inheritance on that husband of yours," Margaret, my grandmother's first business partner, told me bluntly over champagne. She watched her own mother lose everything to a charming man with big ideas and empty pockets. That's why she was so adamant about financial independence for women. This revelation illuminated so much about my grandmother's teachings. Her wisdom hadn't been abstract, it had been born from family experience. In honoring her wishes, I'd unknowingly broken a cycle that had threatened women in my family for generations. To celebrate this understanding, I established the Evelyn Taylor Scholarship for young women pursuing business degrees, funding it with a portion of the investment income from my inheritance. The first 5 recipients would begin their studies in the fall, each receiving not just financial support, but mentoring from successful businesswomen in their fields. My personal healing took longer than the professional reinvention. For months, I struggled with trusting my own judgment in relationships. A coffee date with an architect working on the retreat renovations ended in panic when he mentioned financial troubles with a project, an innocent comment that triggered memories of Jacob's manipulations. Slowly, though, I began reconstructing my ability to trust, first myself, then others. I developed new boundaries and listened more carefully to my instincts. When red flags appeared in any relationship, I acknowledged them rather than explaining them away. The woman who emerged from this process was stronger, more discerning, but still open to connection. By the anniversary of that devastating family dinner, I could look back on the experience with something approaching gratitude. The betrayal had been painful beyond description, but it had also freed me from a marriage built on deception and led me to a life more authentic and fulfilling than I could have imagined. Standing on the porch that spring morning, watching a group of artists setting up easels in the garden, I felt my grandmother's presence beside me. The inheritance she'd left wasn't just financial. It was a legacy of independence, resilience, and the courage to forge my own path. The betrayal had tried to take everything from me, but instead, it had given me something precious, the knowledge that I was stronger than any attempt to diminish or control me. In protecting my inheritance, I discovered my own worth. If you've ever faced betrayal from someone you trusted, I hope my story gives you strength. The journey from hurt to healing isn't quick or easy, but it's possible. Trust your instincts, protect what's rightfully yours, and remember that your worth isn't determined by those who failed to value you properly. I'd love to hear your stories of overcoming betrayal or standing up for yourself in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear that they too can rise from betrayal stronger than before. Thank you for listening to my journey. May you find the courage to honor your own path, whatever challenges you face.